The moment Freddie Mercury stopped being Freddie and became Farrokh. Again, July 13th, 1985, Wembley Stadium, London. 1.9 billion people across the globe were watching the largest television broadcast in history. Live Aid was meant to save lives in Africa, but for Freddie Mercury, standing on that stage in front of 72,000 fans and countless millions watching on screens worldwide, something entirely different was happening. As Queen launched into "We Are the Champions," Freddie's eyes scanned the massive crowd and then suddenly locked on a single face in the sea of humanity. A man was holding an Iranian flag above his head, tears streaming down his face, mouthing words Freddie could read even from the stage. In that instant, the performance stopped being about the music. It became about something Freddie had spent his entire career hiding. The immigrant boy from Zanzibar who had reinvented himself so completely that even his own family barely recognized him in the spotlight. What happened in those final minutes of Queen's set would haunt Freddie for years. And when his family finally revealed the truth in 2020, it explained everything about why that day meant more to him than any other performance in his legendary career. By July 1985, Freddie Mercury had conquered the world. Queen was one of the biggest rock bands on the planet, filling stadiums across continents, dominating radio airwaves, creating anthems that entire generations sang without thinking. Freddie himself had become an icon of rock excess and theatrical brilliance, the flamboyant frontman with the legendary voice and larger-than-life stage presence. But this global success had come at a cost that very few people understood. Freddie Mercury was a carefully constructed persona, a performance that never really stopped even when the concerts ended. The man behind that persona, Farrokh Bulsara, born in Zanzibar to Parsi parents, raised in India, arriving in England as a teenager, had been quietly buried beneath layers of reinvention. The transformation hadn't been accidental. When Farrokh Bulsara decided to pursue music seriously in the late 1960s, he understood immediately that his name, his background, and his immigrant status would be obstacles in the British rock scene. Rock and roll was perceived as a white Western art form. The idea of a Parsi boy from Zanzibar becoming a British rock star seemed almost laughable. So Farrokh became Freddie. The surname Bulsara became Mercury, borrowed from a Queen song lyric, transformed into something that sounded powerful and mysterious without any ethnic markers. He adopted British mannerisms, British slang, British cultural references. He became more British than many people born in Britain, crafting a persona so complete that audiences never questioned whether he belonged. But the cost of this transformation was profound. Freddie rarely spoke about his family in interviews. He almost never mentioned his Parsi heritage, his childhood in Zanzibar and India, or the cultural traditions that had shaped his early years. When journalists asked about his background, he deflected with jokes or theatrical responses that revealed nothing substantive. His family watched this transformation with mixed feelings. Bomi and Jair Bulsara were proud of their son's success, astonished by what he'd achieved. But they also felt a growing distance. The son they'd raised, quiet, thoughtful Farrokh, who'd studied piano at St. Peter's School and shown early musical promise, seemed to have disappeared entirely into this creature called Freddie Mercury. Freddie rarely called home. When he did visit, the conversations were awkward, stilted. He was generous with money, making sure his parents were comfortable, but emotionally, he'd created a wall that seemed impossible to breach. It was as if acknowledging his family, his origins, his real name, might somehow break the spell of the persona he'd created. By 1985, this distance had become almost complete. Freddie Mercury existed in a world of rock stardom, excess, and theatrical performance. Farrokh Bulsara existed only in the private memories of people who'd known him before the transformation, becoming more ghost than reality with each passing year. Live Aid represented the absolute pinnacle of Freddie's career. The event was unprecedented, a global concert broadcast simultaneously from Wembley Stadium in London and JFK Stadium in Philadelphia, featuring the biggest names in music, all performing to raise money for famine relief in Ethiopia. The television audience was estimated at nearly 2 billion people across 150 countries. No performer had ever had access to an audience that large. Queen had been given a 20-minute slot in the middle of the Wembley broadcast, 20 minutes to make an impact in front of the largest audience in entertainment history. The pressure was enormous, But Freddie thrived on pressure. This was his element. The bigger the stage, the bigger the audience, the more he came alive. The performance Queen delivered that day would go down in history as one of the greatest live rock performances ever captured on film. Freddie commanded that stage and that audience with supernatural charisma. Every gesture was perfect. Every note was flawless. The crowd responded to him like he was conducting them. 72,000 people moving and singing in perfect synchronization with his slightest movement. But something was happening inside Freddie that the cameras didn't capture, that the billions watching at home couldn't see. As Queen moved through their set, Bohemian Rhapsody, Radio Gaga, Hammer to Fall, Freddie found himself overwhelmed by the scale of what was happening. This wasn't just a concert. This was validation on a level he'd never experienced. The whole world was watching, and the whole world was accepting him, celebrating him, singing his songs. For someone who'd spent years hiding his true identity, feeling like an outsider trying to pass as something he wasn't, this moment should have been pure triumph. But instead, Freddie felt a strange hollowness. He was being celebrated as Freddie Mercury, the rock god. But Farrokh Bulsara, the immigrant boy who'd worked so hard to become Freddie, was still invisible, still hidden, still something to be ashamed of. Then came We Are the Champions, the final song of Queen's set. As Freddie launched into those opening piano notes and began singing the anthem that had become synonymous with triumph and victory, he scanned the crowd, as he always did, feeding off their energy. That's when he saw the Iranian flag. In the massive sea of faces, one man stood out. He was holding a large Iranian flag above his head, waving it with desperate enthusiasm. The man was crying, his face wet with tears. And as Freddie's eyes met his across the vast distance, the man mouthed words that Freddie could read even without hearing them. Thank you. Thank you for showing us we can do this too. Freddie's voice continued automatically, muscle memory carrying him through the familiar lyrics, but his mind had suddenly gone somewhere else entirely. That flag, that face, those tears, they represented something Freddie had been running from for his entire career. The man holding that flag was an immigrant like Freddie, someone from a part of the world that British rock music didn't acknowledge, that Western popular culture treated as exotic at best and irrelevant at worst. And this man was standing in Wembley Stadium, watching someone who looked like him, who came from a similar background, commanding the biggest stage in the world. In that moment, Freddie understood something he'd been avoiding for years. His reinvention, his transformation from Farrokh to Freddie, wasn't just about personal success. It had inadvertently created a path for others. By proving that someone from his background could succeed in rock music, he'd given hope to countless people who felt like outsiders, who'd been told they didn't belong, who'd been invisible in the cultural narratives of the West. But he'd done it by hiding, by pretending to be something other than what he was, by burying Farrokh so completely that even he sometimes forgot that person had ever existed. As We Are the Champions built toward its climax, Freddie found himself singing the words differently than he ever had before. We are the champions, my friends, and we'll keep on fighting till the end. It wasn't just about Queen anymore. It wasn't just about rock stardom or artistic triumph. It was about every immigrant who'd ever felt they had to hide who they were to succeed. Every person who'd been told they didn't belong and had to fight to prove otherwise. The performance ended. Queen left the stage to thunderous applause. Freddie should have been elated. They'd just delivered a legendary performance to the largest audience in history. But instead, he found himself backstage, overwhelmed by emotions he couldn't quite name. Mary Austin, who knew Freddie better than almost anyone, found him sitting alone in the dressing room area, staring at nothing. That was incredible, Fred, she said gently. You were perfect. Freddie looked up at her, and she was startled to see tears in his eyes. I saw someone in the crowd holding an Iranian flag. He was crying, Mary, crying because of me. That's beautiful, Mary said, not quite understanding why Freddie seemed so shaken by this. Is it? Freddie asked quietly. He thinks I'm like him. He thinks I understand what it's like to be an immigrant, to come from somewhere that people look down on. But I've spent my whole career pretending I'm not. I've hidden everything about where I came from, who my family is, what my real name is. What kind of champion does that make me? The realization hit him with devastating force. He'd spent so long constructing Freddie Mercury that he'd forgotten the cost. He'd gained the whole world's acceptance by denying the part of himself that actually needed accepting. After Live Aid, something shifted in Freddie. The change was subtle at first. He started mentioning his family occasionally in interviews, stopped deflecting quite so aggressively when journalists asked about his background. But the real change was more internal, more profound. That night, for the first time in years, Freddie called his parents. Not a brief, dutiful call, but a real conversation. He told them about the performance, about the Iranian flag, about the man crying in the audience. I realized something today, Freddie told his mother, Jer. I've been ashamed of who I am. Not ashamed of you, never of you, but ashamed of being Farrokh, of being Parsi, of being from Zanzibar. I thought I had to bury all of that to succeed. Jer was silent for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. Farrokh, we have always been proud of you, not because you became Freddie Mercury, because you were brave enough to pursue your dreams even when everyone said it was impossible. But I hid, Freddie said. I pretended to be someone else. No, his mother corrected gently. You became someone new. But Farrokh is still there. He's always been there. Freddie Mercury is what you built, but Farrokh Bulsara is the foundation. Without him, Freddie couldn't exist. That conversation changed something fundamental in Freddie. He began, slowly and carefully, to integrate the two parts of himself that he'd kept so rigidly separated. He started acknowledging his heritage more openly. He reconnected with his family in meaningful ways. He stopped treating his pre-Freddie life as something to be hidden and started seeing it as the source of the strength that had made Freddie possible. The man with the Iranian flag never knew the impact he'd had. He was just a fan, moved by seeing someone who reminded him of himself achieving something extraordinary. But for Freddie, that moment represented a turning point, the beginning of accepting that he didn't have to choose between Farrokh and Freddie. They could coexist. They had to coexist, because denying either one meant denying a fundamental part of his truth. In 2020, 35 years after Live Aid and 29 years after Freddie's death, his family decided to share something they'd kept private for decades. The decision didn't come easily. For years after Freddie's passing, the Bulsara family had protected his privacy fiercely, rarely giving interviews, keeping their memories and conversations with him sacred and personal. But as they watched new generations discover Queen's music and Freddie's legacy, they realized there was a story that needed to be told. Not just about the rock star, but about the immigrant son who'd struggled to reconcile two identities. In a documentary interview about Freddie's legacy and impact on immigrant communities, his sister Kashmira revealed the conversation Freddie had with their mother after Live Aid. The revelation came during a discussion about representation and belonging, topics that had become increasingly important in understanding Freddie's cultural significance. He called Mum that night, Kashmira explained, her voice still emotional even after all those years, her eyes glistening with tears that came from a mixture of pride and lingering grief. Not the usual brief check-in call we'd gotten used to. This was different. He talked for nearly 2 hours, which was extraordinary because Freddie had become so distant from the family. He was crying, really crying, which Mum said she hadn't heard since he was a young boy. Kashmira leaned forward, wanting to get the words exactly right, honoring both her brother's memory and the importance of what he'd shared that night. He told her he'd spent so long trying to be British, trying to fit in, trying to erase every trace of his accent, his background, his otherness. He said he'd been so focused on becoming someone who belonged that he'd forgotten it was okay to be Farrokh too. He said seeing that Iranian flag, this stranger crying because he saw someone like himself on that enormous stage, made him realize he'd been hiding from himself for his entire career. The interviewer asked what their mother had said in response, and Kashmira smiled through her tears, remembering. Mum was quiet for a moment. She was always thoughtful, never rushing to fill silence with empty words. Then she told him something beautiful, something that changed his entire perspective. Kashmira's voice took on the gentle cadence of her mother as she recalled the words. "You didn't stop being Farrokh," Mum said. "You just gave him a bigger voice. Freddie Mercury is how Farrokh Bulsara speaks to the world. The boy I raised, the one who studied piano in India, who was teased for being different, who dreamed bigger than anyone thought possible. He's still there. He's in every note you sing, every stage you command. You didn't erase him. You amplified him." The impact of that conversation was immediate and profound. Kashmira described how Freddie's relationship with the family transformed almost overnight. He started coming home more, not just for obligatory holidays, but for simple Sunday dinners. He asked Mum to cook traditional Parsi dishes he'd avoided for years, saying he'd miss them. He talked about his childhood in Zanzibar in India, stories we hadn't heard him reference in decades. He stopped changing the subject when journalists asked about his family. He even started wearing the gold chain our father had given him, which he'd kept in a drawer for years. Perhaps most significantly, Kashmira revealed, Freddie began exploring ways to incorporate his heritage into his work more explicitly. He talked about eventually doing something that honored Parsi musical traditions, though he never got the chance. But you can hear it in his later work, a willingness to be more vulnerable, more authentic, less concerned with maintaining the impenetrable Freddie Mercury persona. The revelation added profound new dimensions to how people understood Freddie Mercury's legacy. The flamboyant rock god, the theatrical performer, the larger-than-life persona, all of it was absolutely real, but it had been built on a foundation of immigrant struggle, cultural displacement, and the painful process of reinvention that so many immigrants and children of immigrants understand intimately. "We Are the Champions" took on entirely new meaning in light of this understanding. It wasn't just an anthem about winning or athletic triumph. It was about fighting to belong in spaces that weren't designed for you, about proving you deserve a place at the table when others question your right to be there, about refusing to be invisible, even when everything in the culture tells you that people like you should remain in the background. Live Aid. 1985 represented many things to many people. A historic charitable event that raised millions for famine relief. A legendary musical performance that set the standard for live rock. A defining moment in music history that's been analyzed and celebrated for decades. But for Freddie Mercury personally, it was something even more significant. It was the day he stopped running from Farrokh Bulsara and started understanding that his greatest strength, the foundation of everything extraordinary he'd achieved, came from being both identities simultaneously. The immigrant boy who'd dreamed of something bigger than anyone thought possible, and the rock star who'd made those dreams real while carrying that boy inside him the whole time. Today, when people watch the footage of Queen at Live Aid, and millions still do, discovering it anew with each generation, sharing it across social media, introducing their children to what live performance can be, they're watching one of the greatest live performances ever captured on film. The technical perfection, the audience command, the pure charisma radiating from every gesture. But they're also watching, if they know where to look and understand the fuller story, the moment when Freddie Mercury saw himself reflected in an Iranian flag held by a crying stranger in a sea of 72,000 faces and understood something profound. He'd never really stopped being Farrokh Bulsara, no matter how thoroughly he'd convinced himself he'd left that identity behind. He just learned to express that identity through a persona called Freddie Mercury. He'd learned to be both at once, even when he didn't fully realize it.